Before we jump into the next panel, which will be moderated by one of my colleagues, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Adil Najam. He's a professor for international relations at Boston University and incoming president of the WWF International. And he will honor us with a keynote address on the panel's key topic, basically.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a wonderful pleasure and a great honor to be with you in this absolutely spectacular room. My name is Adil Najam, as I was mentioned. I'm going to take the next 20 minutes to talk about climate, to talk about this topic from a climate perspective. And it's a great honor, as I said, to be here with you. The last panel, as well as the talks, were really wonderful. They were so wonderful. They said a lot of things that I had to say, which means I have more to say now, because I want to repeat them. That's how good they were. and I want to do that in this. As I said, it is a great pleasure, especially a pleasure that you are thinking about this topic. I'm a bit of an outsider here. I come from the environment side of the equation, but I also come from the side that has never understood why there are two sides. Right? I have never thought of environment, humans, and nature being in conflict. In fact, part of the challenge that we have is because we have thought like that. And that, in fact, is what has led us here, and that's the message I bring to you. I want to raise 3 questions. I promise not to answer any of them, because we have a wonderful panel of really smart people, much smarter than myself. Then they will have nothing to say. But I want to raise 3 questions of the type that I think we should be thinking about. First, I want to raise this question: what does global mean? I was counting, and I stopped counting at 27. The number of times global was mentioned in the last panel. So after about 15 minutes and 27 mentions, I said, OK. So we talk about it all the time, right? Global climate change, global warming, global pandemic, global finance, global terror, Hakuna Matata, everyone together. Right? But we talk about it as if it's real, and I want to spend a few minutes. You know, the commissioner is not here. A lot of what I'm going to say is about what he said, linking to what he said. But he said, you know, if Europe as a country. And I want to think about, what does it mean to be global? What if we were truly honest when we say global? Because I think we are not always honest. We mean many other things when we say global. We sometimes mean international. We sometimes mean just my values. But what does truly global mean? I want us to think about that. Second, I want to talk about what is the climate telling us. Not what professors are telling us, not what climate scientists are telling us, not what climate organizations are telling us, not what the IPCC is telling us. Something is being told to me by what's happening outside that window. And that doesn't always match. I served on the IPCC for 3 reports. I was a lead author, I was a vice chair, and I'm very, very fond of it. But at some point, I realized there was a disconnect. And I want to talk about what is the climate telling us, not what politicians are telling us. Because the disconnect is, everyone is telling us they are doing great things. I haven't met a person who isn't telling me all the great things they're doing. So why isn't the picture outside my window changing? Right? So I wanted to think us to think about what is the climate telling us. And the third question I want to raise is, what is the age of adaptation, this thing that I want to talk about, that we are now in what I call the age of adaptation? What is the age of adaptation saying to the humanitarian section? Right? Just, I assume everyone knows this, mitigation, adaptation. Mitigation is, what do you do so that a problem doesn't happen? That's what we usually talk about. Right? Plant trees, reduce carbon, electric vehicles, solar panels. That's mitigation. If you fail to mitigate, you have to adapt. So adaptation is the failure of mitigation. What happens if you have to adapt to a changing climate? Right? That's adaptation. And my basic argument is we are now in the age of adaptation. I need to say this and say this clearly. So if you take any notes, this is the only place you need to take notes. Adaptation is the failure of mitigation. but it is not the opposite of mitigation. So to say we need to adapt does not mean we don't mitigate, because the less you mitigate, the more you will have to adapt. Right? So as the Americans say, you have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time. You have to do both. It's not one or the other. It's not the enemy of mitigation. So those are three questions. I'm sorry I've taken more time, so I'll just, like a good Pakistani, speak faster. I have a proposition. And the proposition I want to make here essentially is that we live now in the age of adaptation, because of which climate is fundamentally being seen as a human issue. That's not a link. I'm not interested in the link between humanitarianism and climate. I'm interested in looking at climate as a human issue. And climate, therefore, is too important to leave to people like me. You make a mistake if you think I'm going to solve it, or the IPCC is going to solve it, or God forbid, the COP is going to solve it. Right? It is just too important. Now, that's too many words on a screen, so just to highlight the proposition as three parts. First, we live in what I was calling the age of adaptation. Won't go into it. Second, climate is fundamentally a human issue. I say fundamentally for a reason. Right? We have tackled it in policy essentially as a science issue, as we should have. And it is a science issue. And science says carbon reduction. Or we have tackled it as an economic issue. And we should have tackled it as an economic issue. Sticks and carrots, subsidies, oil pricing, and so on and so forth. But what I'm saying is, especially in the age of adaptation, it is fundamentally a human issue. We live where we live, we eat what we eat, we believe what we believe, we cry at what we cry at, we shout at who we shout at. Because climate defined it thus. And finally, that climate is too important to be left to the climate people. That's my plea, that's my message here. So let me start with something silly. This is too nice a room to be silly in, but let me be silly for a minute. The commissioner said, think of EU as a country maybe for a minute. I want to go further. Imagine for a moment you are not in Vienna. I give this to my students as an actual assignment. Imagine you're not in Vienna. Imagine you're not in Austria. Imagine you're not in the EU. Imagine you're not even on this planet. You're on some other planet. And you're looking down on this thing called Earth, right? Choose your planet. There used to be 9, now they say there are 8. One of them is not doing very well. But you're looking down on this thing called Earth, and you have to write for a college professor or the World Bank a 2-page report. I'm sure Doctors Without Borders have those reports on what sort of a country is this. Right? We write those reports. This is the type of country it is. 2 pages, 12-point Times Roman, no footnotes. What would you come up with? You could come up with many stories. There's more food in this, but there are more hungry people. There's more money in this planet than ever before. There's more technology in this planet than ever before. You could come up with many stories. I'll tell you one story. You could come up with alternatives. You will come up in those 2 pages with the view that country Earth is a poor country. 1 billion people living on less than $1 a day. Right? So I don't need to give you these numbers. You know this better than me. But you will come to the conclusion it's not just a poor country, it's a divided country. And I don't mean divided as in rich country, poor country. I mean rich people, poor people. I'm a Pakistani who lives in Boston. I live in the first world part of Boston. 1.5 miles from where I teach is the third world part of Boston. I went back to Pakistan. I was vice chancellor of a university in Lahore. That was the first world part of Lahore. 1.5 miles from where I worked was Bhatta Chowk, the third world part of Lahore, right? So the champagne glass that my compatriot Mehbubul Haq came with, 80% of its resources serve 20% of its people. Actually, it's even less now. Right? So it's much more the champagne glass than the beer mug you would like to have. And so it's a poor country that you live in. It's a divided country you live in. It is a poorly governed country you live in. By all the things that we all talk about in our work about what good governance is, try applying it to the Earth and how we manage global issues. All animals equal, 5 are more equal than others. Right? So you will come to that conclusion. I'm rushing through this. Not only do we live on a poor country, divided country, poorly governed country, we live on an insecure country. Not just because of the useless wars that create work for you, But because of food insecurity and water insecurity and climate insecurity and human insecurity, you will easily come to the conclusion this country we are looking at called Earth is poor, divided, poorly governed, insecure. It is not just those, it is degraded. I don't need to tell you about it. Its water is not worth drinking, so we drink out of bottles. Its forests are degraded, its land is denuded, its climate is changing, its seas are rising, all the things that you talk about. Right? Now, again, you could give an alternative story. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying this is one story that could be written. You would come to the conclusion you live on an angry planet. Right? Especially look at what was on your feed or newspaper right before COVID. It was pictures of angry people, especially angry young people. I don't say this in an accusatory way. I identify with Greta. I identify. She's right to be angry. But think about what were the pictures on your feed. It was yellow umbrellas in Hong Kong. It was young people out on the street in Lebanon. It was young people out at JNU in New Delhi. It was Extinction Rebellion in London. It was young, angry people in New York. It was in Argentina. And they're angry for a reason. Right? Because me and my people, my generation, has been promising them that we are working hard. And like kids at the back of the car, they are saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And we are not. And we kept saying, no, we're working hard. We'll give this to 2050. Let's do 2070. Right? A promise for future action without current activity. So they're angry. There is an angry planet, and you would come to the conclusion that it's not just a poor, divided, poorly governed, insecure, degraded, angry planet. It is an unsafe planet. I'm a Pakistani who lives in the US. I know all about travel advisories. If there was a travel advisory on the planet Earth, it would be catch the first rocket ship out of here. The problem is we don't know where to go. Not yet. Elon Musk is working on that. The point I'm trying to make is we live on a third world planet. I don't like that term. I've never liked that term, but in this context, it is right. We think we live on planet Sweden or planet Austria, and we do global policy, especially on climate, as if that's the planet we are making this policy for. And that is, I think, why a lot of things said in the last panel are the way they are. There's a disconnect in how we act about what we are doing and the place where we are doing it. Right? Again, my apologies for putting this here. I won't go too much into this because of time, but other because you know. People now know what Paris means in this context, right? It no longer means that steel structure that some people consider beautiful. It means this agreement that's not even an agreement. It's not an agreement, right? It's a promissory note. There's no legal basis to it, but I'm a creature of the COPs. I was at every COP from pre-COP till Copenhagen. At Copenhagen, I put an embargo on myself, never again. I broke the embargo in Paris. And 15 minutes later, I repented. But having said that, I wish the COPs well. I wish them well. I want to see those things happening. I'm just not sure they will. 2 numbers came out of COPs, right? And again, I'm trying to be fast here. One number was this. I used to put this number up as an example of what a big number looks like. Right? That's 100 billion. Now, we knew at Paris, most of us who work on this knew this would never show up. It's like that 25% thing that you thought was a scandal. You and I should talk about scandals. I have a whole list. Right? This was one of them. We knew that. It's going to actually show up next year because all the agencies are trying to recalibrate what they are doing by stamping them as green so that they can say they don't have the embarrassment of the last COP. But that number, the reason I put it here today is not because it is big, but it is so small. We thought 100 billion a year was big. 100 billion, here's what you compare it with. 39 billion cost actually paid by poor people for Pakistan's flood. And the reason it's a small number is COVID just reminded us how small a number this was. When you actually believe in something, not just slogans, the money shows up. If anyone ever says to you there isn't the money, they're lying. What they're really saying is, I don't want you to get that money. When we actually believed in it, it took the US Congress 9 days to invent $1 trillion, and 5 days to spend it. Right? So this is a question of will. not of dollars. But the more important numbers that came out there were these other numbers, right? 1.5 to 2. And you would have noticed, including today, people have stopped talking about the 1.5. Right? The first speech, we already started changing gear to 2. Because no one ever believed in 1.5. It was the poor, vulnerable, small island countries who said, we are going to die, guys. We didn't want to do that. At this point, I hope I am wrong. I will give anything in the world to be wrong on this. I do not know of any credible science that can get you to 1.5. I don't know of any credible science that can get you to 1.5. I hope I'm wrong. I can imagine utopias where that happens, and I wish we get there. Let me take you back to 2020. Remember 2020 and all the memos we were writing? This is a year like no others. You guys are working very hard at home. Thank you very much for that. We all did that. I did too. Right? There was this other disease that came in 2020. One was the pandemic, and the other disease was Zoom. Remember Zoom? That's me on Zoom teaching my class. The only good thing that comes from Zoom is the background. This is me teaching on sustainable development, changing the background every week. But that's not what I'm putting it. The reason I'm putting it is 2020 was a year like no other. Just like every year is a year like no other. Let me remind you what happened in 2020 while we were all learning Zoom. January. Hottest January ever recorded since we've started recording temperatures till then. February, second hottest February ever recorded. Right? The point I'm making is climate is not a future issue. March, second hottest March ever recorded since we've been recording temperature. April, second hottest ever. May, hottest ever. June, hottest ever. The big news today was certainly Greece. The other big news right next to it, but much smaller font, this June that just ended, hottest June ever recorded. So this one already got broken. I think 6 of them have. July, second hottest. August, second hottest. I don't want to even read this. By this time, you stopped retweeting it. Remember, in the beginning, we retweeted it, and then it just became normal. Every month is going to be like that. December gave it a little respect. As far as I can tell, about 6 of these have been broken since then. The point I'm making, climate is not a future issue. Some years ago, I've all my life used future graphs. Like climate people love those, 2100, 2050, whatever. Another embargo I put on myself was I will try as much as possible never to use a graph in the future, of the future. Because it gives people the sense we have time. So let me tell you, if you still don't believe that this is happening, this was a tweet I did on 29th of April 22, when, according to my calculation, 1 billion people, 1 billion, in where I come from, South Asia, were seeing temperatures of more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, in most cases 117 degrees Fahrenheit on that day. We are South Asians, we are tough, we can take the heat. But not 1 billion people, not in April. Right? This is happening again right now. The point I was saying about the future. So let me just show, I hope you can see the graph. This is not future. I'm not saying what will happen. This is actual recorded temperature for every month since we have actually recorded temperature. Right? So this idea that climate is a future thing is the biggest thing I want to challenge here today. Because the urgency comes here, right? So you can look at that, 1990, 97, that's the 1.5, that's the 2. I will stop that at 2016. I can go further. It will start touching nearly 1.5. That doesn't mean we are at 1.5 because it has to be average the way it's calculated. Right? Now, you're saying that's fine, but I don't live on the whole planet. I live in Vienna, and it is a beautiful, spectacular day outside. Right? I can tell you you're about to brace for a really bad summer, just like we are elsewhere. But if you don't, if you want to look at your place, then I've put the same data on another map. This is the same data for every place on Earth that we have temperature for. This is not the future. This is not a prediction. This is not a projection. Choose the place you want. Right? Choose the place where you work. Choose the place where you live. This is a reality. By my calculation, there is about a little more than 2 billion people today, 2 billion, whose livelihoods are today being affected by climate change. They're losing their livelihood in some ways. I imagine some of them were on that boat yesterday. It's not just war that makes people move. Your ability to live somehow gets constrained, right? That's, again, not in the future. That's not IPCC stuff. That's simply where we are, what I see outside that window. This is why that 1.5 is important. We can gently, as we did today, change our speeches and change the 1.5 to 2. And you say, you know, what's 0.5 degrees between friends? That changes between morning and evening, right? Again, I don't have the time to go into this. This is an IPCC report I did have something to do with. But what does 5.5 degree in global temperature mean between friends? It means 2.6 times, 260% the heat. Right? That doesn't mean the heat goes 2.6 times up. The difference that will be made between 1.5 and 2 is that. What it means is species loss double with that 0.5. What it means is 30% more coral reef loss. What it means is 2 times worse fisheries. You say, why is he talking about fisheries? Because those guys on the boat, some of them might have been fisher folk. That's how you get on that boat. Right? That's the humanitarian connection. That's the human connection. So 0.5 is serious, right? And this is really that point I want to say, that we are in the age of adaptation. You are in the age of adaptation. That means we have to adapt as we mitigate. We have to mitigate more so that we can adapt less, but we cannot. Poor people certainly cannot not adapt. The good thing is we are actually very good as a species at adaptation. That's why we are in these nice rooms. Right? For 5 million years, we've been really good at adapting. It rains, we get an umbrella. Adaptation. It's cold, we wear a sweater. Adaptation. Right? That's a human speciality. The problem is all adaptation is cost. The umbrella costs. The sweater costs. Right? And that is why it is here, it is now, and we need to think differently about climate change. I'll be quick about this, but I want to put this up. I want to start with nature. We don't really think about, we think only we adapt. The human arrogance is as if climate is only happening to us. It's not. Right? And when we think of nature, we usually think of that beautiful picture my friends put up of an ice slab with a polar bear. You've seen that? Right? The polar bear in the middle of the sea. And I've always thought that's a bad picture. It's kind of like the pictures you humanitarian guys use, because it kind of gives you the sense as if the polar bear is waiting for me to come and help it. Right? It's a helpless picture, the polar bear in the middle of the ocean, as if we have to really act, go save the polar bear. Here's the thing, here's the news. Where are you, Andrea? This you haven't heard, I think. I spoke to a few polar bears. They don't have faith in us. They're not waiting. They have no belief that we are going to do the right thing this time because they haven't ever seen us do it before. When nature gets hit, this is in your title, it strikes back. It gets angry, nature responds. That's what nature does, the same thing we do. Nature does with crisis what we did in COVID. Hell with principles, no one come to my country, borders closed, don't you come near me. Right? And that's why this is a bit picture. The better picture is this one. This is what you guys work on, right? This cute fellow is dengue. There isn't a reason why dengue is in Lahore. Okay, Lahore, I understand. But it shouldn't be in the foothills of the Himalayas. Right? It's a tropical disease. Now, it's partly because we travel more and we take disease and vector-borne and so on and so forth, but it's also because the dengue mosquito, all mosquitoes are much better at adaptation than us. The vectors change, right? That's what humanitarian and climate is about. Not just a solar panel, right? Water. To me, water is the front line. Water is to adaptation what carbon was to mitigation. This is my country, Pakistan. This is the Indus. But when we think of the water, we just don't think of the mighty, beautiful Indus. We think also of water disappearing or water being too much. That's the flood. That's what a flood looks like. It's not your basement having a little water. Right? And as I said, water is important because water is to adaptation. Water is the frontline issue. I have all my life trained people in managing carbon. We need a new generation that is trained in water because that's how you will write the story of climate change. Think about what happens when climate changes. Right? Many, not all, impacts are wet. Water rises, sea level rise. Water disappears, drought. Water melts, glaciers. Water falls from the sky, floods. Water causes disease. Right? So water is the frontline issue. And I'll just put this very, very quickly. In the last flood in 2010, I was trying to raise money to help folks in my country, and I realized I couldn't explain what a flood was. So look at that blue squiggle. Right? That blue squiggle is the area affected by the floods. Keep that blue squiggle in mind. I took that squiggle, and to scale, I put it on a map of the US. That's what it covered, Vermont to Florida. I put it on a map of Japan. That's what it covers. Right? So when it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to see the scale. I put it on a map of Europe, Denmark down to France. Right? So this is why water is the frontline issue in many, many ways. I won't go into living in this, which is the project I'm doing. Because of time, I'll just rush through this. I do want to say, if you're talking water, you're immediately talking food. Because what is food except nature's way of packaging water so that you can transport it? Not really, but kind of. Right? I won't go into it because it's so obvious. What I will go into, and I'm really afraid because this is your territory, is refugees. Right? When we think of refugees, we think of pictures like this. Right? There are other people here who know more about climate and migration than I do, but let me say a few things. We usually think of pictures like this. Today, actually, the picture we are thinking is more like this. Right? But as you think about climate, you have to think differently about this picture. In our subconscious, we are still thinking most of the people in that boat came because of war. I would suggest as many came because of livelihood being threatened in some other way. Climate is the enemy just like war, because it pushes people to a place where they cannot survive where they are. Right? And that's how one of the ways you think about it. I won't go too much into this, but I'll give you, some of you might have worked on this. This is the Parrot's Beak region in Guinea. You see the Parrot's Beak at the bottom of the screen, and Sierra Leone around it. Look at the date, January 6, 1974. Let me fast forward it, right? So January 6, 1974, December 19, 1999. What happened? Why is Guinea gone light green? Because there was a war. Where was the war? Some of you might have been there. Not in Guinea. It was in Sierra Leone. Smart people move. Well before they go to Greece, they go to Guinea or whatever is next door. When that happens, they have to survive. There are new pressures on the environment. Right? So if we think about that link seriously, it's not just about reducing my travel and putting a solar panel and not using paper cups. You have to think about those links. Again, for rush reasons, I won't go into energy. We talk a lot about energy, but energy turns out into sort of solar and wind. Yes, solar and wind is very good. I do not worry about that because the transition is happening. I worry about the 2 billion people in energy poverty who do not have enough energy, who are going to be left behind on this. That's what's going to give you the energy transition. Again, mobility. I'm rushing through this. Mobility is, we think immediately Tesla. Tesla is fun. I wish I could someday afford one. Where I come from, the mobility question with climate is not Tesla. It's not going to be solved by Tesla. That's my mobility question are those pictures. My mobility question is moving a lot of people to a lot of places, particularly women, and particularly giving them dignified mobility, one of the biggest reasons for lack both in education and work. Right? So what I'm saying is, this is where the human part comes in and the humanitarian comes in, that we have to think about the pressures that are causing these crises differently. Infrastructure, again, won't go into it, but my infrastructure is not beautiful buildings with green energy. My infrastructure is the slum. I will take a minute on heat, please. Heat is one of the things climate people got wrong. We didn't think it would be this big, this quick. Right? No one should see these pictures. Tell me why these climate pictures are not humanitarian pictures. I come from Pakistan. In most of Pakistan, in much of India, we used to have 4 seasons. Now we have 5. The 5th season is extreme heat. 600 to 800 people will die in Karachi in a month. 600 to 800 people will die in Delhi. About 2,000 people will die in Bombay. Why is that not a humanitarian issue? Because of extreme heat. right? It's not just because of climate. We know the solution. It's hydration, it's shade. A lot of the people who will be dying will be the homeless, because I will have a fan, right? But these pictures, again, should not be shown. My climate people don't think these are climate pictures because they don't have carbon. My humanitarian friends don't think these are humanitarian pictures because there isn't a war. And meanwhile, people die. Right? That is my message, that someone has to think about this humanitarian. Those are bodies in the ED center in Karachi about to be buried in a ditch because they're all unclaimed homeless people. How is that not a humanitarian picture, I ask? How is that not a climate picture, I ask? Right? And yet these issues are being left. I have this last slide, and then I promise to shut up. Right? So how do we rethink climate in the age of adaptation? 4 things, I think. We move from thinking about climate as mostly energy, meaning mostly carbon, to thinking about it as nearly everything. Not that so that it stymies us, but it is the defining thing in that sense. We think what you said, and thank you for saying that multiple times, about thinking from maximizing security, which is what policy has been about, to minimizing insecurity. People do not move because there is a security challenge. People move because they become insecure. When you securitize problems, you get what you get, just like you get IMF solutions. The solutions become securitized. But the security lens, we are going to make people secure, takes you in a totally different direction than if you say, my task is to make people insecure, less insecure. Right? Whether it is because of conflict or other things. You do both, but you move from thinking international to thinking global. This is my most insidious point of the whole talk. International is between nations. Global is where I started, very difficult. I love the UN. I love the UN. That's why I put those pictures with Ban Ki-moon. But the problem is, the basic assumption of international, including in your field and mine, is countries will come together, each will work for their national interest, each will maximize their national interest, and somehow the sum of their national interest will be our common interest. That does not work. That math simply does not work for these issues. When we think international, we immediately become altruistic. I will help you. Right? That's the only lever you have in international. It's a very good lever. That's why we talk aid. When you think global, you have to confront justice. Right? That's why I kept thinking of, is there a 4th principle for humanitarianism? Where is responsibility? Right? That's where loss and damage comes, and so on and so forth. And the last point, and I end with this, think of adaptation not as a problem, but as an opportunity. I really apologize for taking too long, and I apologize to my colleagues again, but thank you for giving me this opportunity. I hope I have not said anything wrong. Thank you very much.
Super good, thank you. May I take one of the glass of water from your side? Thank you so much for this very inspiring words, Adil. I'm obviously not Corina Milborn. My name is Teresa Gruber. I work for SOS Children's Villages, and I have the pleasure to step in and moderate this wonderful panel. I'm introducing the panelists. So we have the honor of having Paul Knox Clarke, Principal of ADAPT. On my right side, also Véronique Geoffroy. She's Director of URD. You already had a special introduction from Adil as the incoming president of the WWF International. And we have Koko, who is the director of the Global Data Institute at the IOM. Thank you very much for being with us today. So our panel today is When Nature Strikes Back, the Humanitarian Aid in Times of Climate Change. And we've heard the word of crisis a lot right now, and I would like to start with you, Paul. In your opinion, would you say that directly the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis?
Yes. No, sorry. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. But I think a lot of people I respect, a lot of very intelligent, experienced humanitarians disagree with me. They don't think it is. And in fact, if I may, I will take out a recent message that I got. I talk about climate quite a lot with humanitarians. This is from a very experienced humanitarian, no names, but it's a fairly representative communication, which says, isn't the issue about climate one of salience? Is climate really a salient question in fragile and conflict-affected contexts? Maybe the thing to learn from humanitarians is to prioritize the near-term and salient issue and leave off the longer-term and structural issues, whereby climate is a long-term policy kind of structural thing that sort of gets talked about a little bit in Geneva, and maybe you've got a person who does the climate stuff, and it's not really a conflict issue, it's not really for us. Well, I think Adil has made it very clear why it is for us, and if I can just stand on his shoulders for a second, I think it's a humanitarian issue for two reasons. One, if we go back to what Mervat said, is there here an issue about saving lives and reducing suffering? I think fairly evidently yes. The IPCC AR6, so the last report, said, and I'm surprised this isn't talked about more, said that this decade, the period to 1.5, so to around 2035, sometime around there, is a phased transition in terms of weather-related disasters. We're moving into a place we have never been in before, and it's happening, as Adil was saying, now. So we can expect, and we're already seeing, so we have the evidence in front of our eyes as well as the projections. We can see more disasters, more frequent disasters, more impactful disasters, more complex disasters with things happening at the same time, and more unexpected disasters. And all of that, if that's not a humanitarian concern, then I think we need to kind of go back and ask ourselves what humanitarian is. So the first, does it meet the first criterion? I think amply yes. But there's a second criterion, because of course humanitarian action tends not to be an international or indeed a global issue. It tends to focus the scarce resources on fragile and conflict-affected states, and particularly where the state cannot or will not provide support. So another reason that people say this isn't a humanitarian issue is, well, it's not really a conflict thing, isn't it? And somehow we've kind of created this idea that conflict and weather-related crises are different by nature, they're just different things. And a lot of people who are very involved in conflict say this to me. They say, well, look, my thing is conflict. Yeah? To which I would say, fragile and conflict-affected states, so the World Bank list of fragile and conflict-affected states, are massively, disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. That's partly geological or geographical accident, because the risks are higher for many of them. But of course, it's very largely because the adaptation that Adil was talking about is very, very hard to do for people who are living in a war and for a state that doesn't have tax revenues to do anything about it. So that makes them more vulnerable. And then even worse, to add insult to injury, those states receive almost no climate finance, because it's too difficult. It's too difficult to spend climate money in those places. And they don't get talked about very much, actually, in the climate discourse either. So, to wrap up, and sorry I've gone on a little bit, but yes, it's humanitarian because it's about life and it's about suffering. Yes, it's humanitarian because it's about conflict and fragile affected states. And if I haven't convinced you, I would just ask you to look at the situation in Somalia, where the drought has been attributed to climate change. It would not have happened in a cooler world, where the Shabelle River flooding over the last month is exactly in line with what climate statistics suggest, and where we have not yet seen the heat waves that we can probably expect. But Somalia, by some projections, parts of Somalia will have a 50% chance of deadly heat waves in the next decade. So, is it a humanitarian issue? Look at Somalia.
Thank you very much for that very clear answer. So right now we're talking about the climate crisis and the roles also of humanitarian, and we've discussed and heard about also in your keynote about the area of adaptation. And here what I would be very interested in is to hear, against this background, what is the role of humanitarian sector and actor in this context where we have right now the area of adaptation? Perhaps Véronique.
Yeah, we can try to talk about the role of the humanitarian system as such, but what struck me, and thanks for your great presentation, is that the humanitarian sector alone will not be able to deal with the situation. So we have to open doors. We have to learn how to work with development actors, with climate sector, with environmental sector, and maybe most of all with local actors. Because all this situation is going to lead us to a situation where we can't deal with the level of needs. And we really have to learn, and we'll come back on the discussion we had earlier this morning about the place of the local actors in their diversity, not only talking about those local NGOs that look like international NGOs, and yeah, we can learn how to work with them, give them more money. It is something important. But my point is that this issue of climate change and environmental crisis is a whole of society issue. In southern countries, in northern countries, and we have to learn how to adapt, yes, in the different local places, and this is going to be a challenge for the current and coming years, together with the youth, local and activist youth working on climate issues, local justice movement, local authorities at local level, municipal level, dealing with the daily impacts of climate change. And when I see the humanitarian sector as it stands now, super vertical, super institutionalized, with a lot of money going from north to south, and the difficulties we have to learn how to work with those local NGOs that look like us, we have a lot more to learn about how to work and support local wall of society and local social fabric of responding to disaster, preparing in front of the disaster to come. So this is for me something really important that we still have to work on. And you know, when you, as many of us, you go and at the ground level and you start to look at who is responding, you realize that indeed neighbors, local association, groups of volunteers, municipalities are the first to respond and organize themselves in times of disaster. How do we, as humanitarian actors, work with them? How do we really support these local movements? The example of Ukraine last year was, it's not a climate crisis, but make it very clear that we don't know how to work with volunteers, informal groups. And there is, for me, this is really something really important. If we want to be able to respond to the level of needs to come, we really have to invest more and further into this localization, let's call it like that, effort. Yep.
Thank you very much, Véronique. We're discussing exactly what efforts it should take to really address these big challenges of the crisis, of the climate crisis, and the raising humanitarian crisis. And Koko, here we were discussing also the real question. I think we have a lot of practitioners here, and we're looking also into the solutions. So in these times of constant crisis, what is it going to take to really be able to have a certain sense of stability again, or addressing what Adil said, that minimizing also this already insecurity here?
I graduated in this room. So when I came in this morning speaking to those of you who are still studying, and I was looking at these amazing murals by Klimt. And if you look up, you see how we've thought of the world, which is discipline specific. And so for you, particularly youth and students, in some ways I want to talk to you because the climate is the future. It's here as Adil. What a delightful and visceral set of comments that you shared, and also to Paul and Véronique. So what do we do? First of all, my sense is the difficulty, this is the future, and for you, youth, sometimes I feel that what we're talking about is unspeakable because it's our lives. This is not mid-century. It's our lives. We will experience this, whether it's the heat. North America, where I'm from, is experiencing continental heat domes. We as mammals haven't yet experienced this, at least not big mammals like ourselves. And we could go on, you said it so well, all of you said it so well. And I think the trouble is partly I feel loss, I feel grief, and of course the anger and indignation and the fault of it all. And the fault is not yours. And yet, this is our reality. We must act. And there is so much to act. So for you as students, I would ask you to help us rethink and channel the energy, whether it is grief, anger, intelligence, genius, and best of all, curiosity and love, and channel it towards understanding how this world works and help us figure out the very specific and practical ways to step out into the future, because it is here. And climate change, it won't go away. If you think, I don't think it's a crisis, and I'm not sure if you say it's humanitarian, because I'm thinking the real question is, how do we maintain stability? Exactly as you said, Adil, stability gave us the world as we know it. Stability is the ability to cooperate. It created clean water systems for those of us who get to enjoy that. It created medicine, it created science, all of these things. It's what our families are made out of. And if we were in a family, the very mundane conversations that we have every day over breakfast or dinner are so boring. And you're looking at the paper and you say, oh, well, look at this. And then the other family member says, oh, well, look at that. It's not very exciting, but that is the stuff of building the future. It's turning to your neighbor and saying, well, I tried out this. It seems to have worked really well. You should do it. That's how big change happens. Big change happens through very specific things that you tell your neighbor who's like you and who you trust, and they tell their neighbor. It's an endorsement. It's saying, did you try this? It's how dietary change happens. It's how big change and small change happens. So to be specific, we need 3 types of practical shifts in our world. One group of shifts is creating some breathing space. We need clear risk signals, and we need to understand what risk means for our societies. And we need to act on them. If you're a city planner, it means zoning. We need to figure out the very difficult myriad decisions that it will take to reduce the exposure of people in our town, in our country, on our coasts. Water, so compelling. We have to figure out how do we reduce exposure. We have to figure out how to reduce vulnerability, be that social safety nets, be it building community networks. This is at every scale, so there is more than enough room for all of you, particularly those of you who are about to finish your degrees. A second, and I'll hurry because I know we have so much to talk about, is we do need to change our paths. I work for the International Organization of Migration, and we literally talk about pathways. Sometimes the pathways are very long, across very long distances, and involve arduous journeys. Sometimes the pathways are, is this humanitarian? Is it donor? Or is it development? Sometimes the pathways are you talking to your representatives and asking whether the national budget could be defined differently on the back end. So we need to rethink our pathways, definitely rethink our silos, because this is about stability, and it's all of us. This is not far away in space or time. It's our families, it's where we live, and you know, it is all of us together. And the third thing is that people need to be in the center. And that has to do with building trust. And this is one of the real challenges. The change is coming so quickly. It's large, it's deeply disruptive. We don't have that much experience. We're built along, you know, sectors and silos. And the way to navigate through it in these very practical things requires us to change, and I think all of us actually really hate change. It's so inconvenient and uncomfortable. Who likes to change? But we need cool heads and big hearts to change, and we can only do that by building trust, by turning to our family members and saying, oh, did you see that? Or, oh, what's that you're using? It's really kind of boring, but it's the essential way that we are going to step out into tomorrow, which might be hot, and next year, which may not have enough water, the Danube, the Alps, the whatever part of the world you're in, because this is about stability.
Thank you very much. I've heard this also was addressed about the need for cooperation, and you mentioned that the silos that somehow we're still working on, it's the challenges that we need to overcome them somehow. Adil, you have mentioned a couple of times that climate is so important to leave it to the climate people. So is it an issue that we also should leave it to the humanitarian sector?
I have already had the privilege of having my say, so I'll keep it short because I want to hear my friends. I think humanitarianism is also too important to leave it just to the humanitarian sector. I apologize. Right? I think this is what you're saying with local actors. And local actors just doesn't only mean local NGOs. When the flood hits my home, the first thing I do is not go to any local or international NGO. I send my kids and my wife to my brother's house upstream. Right? There is a whole infrastructure and climate is the same. So climate is the same. So I think climate, humanitarian, these issues are too big to be left to anyone. The silos that we created, I understand them. The disciplines we created in universities, the organizational structure we created in the international system, it makes sense, it makes sense. But we also have to work for that system to talk to each other. Right? And I also understand why the turf happens, because the money gets divided. Right? $1 to your organization is $1 not to my organization. And that's where the whole sort of, the managerial class, people like me, start sort of coming in. But somewhere, someone has to be the custodian of those links. And in that sense, if I take the question to what would I want the humanitarian sector to do in some ways, taking on from Paul and Koko and others, Véronique, that was said. One is, do think beyond disaster. Even my own sector, climate people, when they think of impacts, they think disasters. And certainly, I think most of my humanitarian sector friends think, okay, climate gets triggered either by my reducing my carbon solar panel in my office, or when disaster happens. But there is a pre-disaster phase, just like there's a pre-conflict phase. Disaster is too late. In my country, Pakistan, the biggest agency working on climate is something called NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority. They have the money. The problem with taking a disaster approach only to climate is you wait for disaster. Right? You can't go there until the disaster has happened. And it's too late. Right? So in a way, we do need to rethink, but I think there's an opportunity there. I think there is an opportunity there. Rethink conflict also. I think we have to rethink. My friend Peter Frankopan, who's at Oxford, he's a historian. I hope some of you have read his book. If not, shame on you. Has written this huge book called The Earth Transformed. It's a 5,000-year history of human conflict, right? One of those grand history. And his essential argument is that conflict happens essentially for 3 reasons. Right? We are too close to it to think. He said, in the long span of history, not only for 3 reasons, but 3 big reasons. One, he says, is disease. Sort of conflict and change. The other, he says, is climate. And the third, he says, is demography. He says those are the big levers of history. And things get organized around that in microcosms of centuries and stuff. But those are levers you can change. And finally, to end on this, please lend your voice even if you don't lend your action. Right? Just like you were talking so eloquently about you have to stop conflict so that you guys have less to do. Right? The message is the same with climate. But that voice, the credibility that you bring, your organizations bring, will go a long way in saying not only will we reduce our carbon a little, but you need to stop this thing because it's going to change our work and make the world much worse off.
Yes. I would like to go to Véronique because she also started with the issue about the local structures and how we react to this crisis, to this climate crisis that at the same time evoke this humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to build on what Adil just said, and I think that there is an emerging discussion, a bit subversive, but let's put it on the table. I think that many movements are really starting to think about the political analysis of the situation, because the climate and environmental global crisis we are facing right now are the result of an organized system of abusive exploitation of our environment and predation of living systems. And this is the legacy of centuries of history that have enabled our societies to achieve unprecedented technological developments based on science and the exploitation of natural resources, particularly in colonized countries. So there are numerous civil societies, movements in the North, in the global North and global South, that are starting to denounce this legacy and try to break this situation, starting with the youth movement committed on climate issues, ecofeminist movements in many southern countries that reject all forms of domination, both on nature and women. And the exchanges between these movements is really fertile, building bridges between different groups, and this is bringing, this is something really political, yeah? Because this is calling for a brave decision and calling for politicians to take action about that. And what does this have to do with humanitarian aid? For some people and some organizations, this is still nothing to do with them, but for some others, they are starting to engage in this climate justice movement and thinking and political analysis with their southern counterparts, because this is coming strong and loud and clear from the southern counterpart. And I think that humanitarian organizations have to recognize that they have developed at the same time as neoliberalism. And we are the fruit of the development models that are the root causes of the climate change. So there is a need to change and to think quite radically about that if we want to remain relevant or at least not be part of the problem. Yeah? So we have to take part in those discussions with other actors, with the youth movement, with the Southern ecofeminist movements. We have to maybe use the clout that humanitarian organizations have to be part of this advocacy. And we have to support those frontline activists. People dealing with environmental issues are targets, yeah, in many places, because they are political, they are tackling the root causes of this situation. So of course, this is not all a humanitarian issue, but this is an existential threat for all of us, and there are needs to open those discussions and to take part of the discussion as a humanitarian organization. This is what I would say.
I would like to go back to you, Paul, right now for a reaction also to what Véronique just said, because here we're seeing what the humanitarian sector could do in terms of also linking up with certain climate justice. And I was thinking about here the big issue we discussed already about the obligation to remedy consequences also. And we're talking about, my specific question is really, what should, against this background, be the real priorities of humanitarian action?
Thank you. I won't go back to the area that Véronique's been talking about because I think she's expressed it so eloquently. Maybe I'd take that in a slightly different programmatic direction rather than the advocacy role of the agencies, which is noting that that is extremely important. And that we maybe under-recognize what the potential that we have for advocacy. But programmatically, I think there are three priorities. You know, if something that I think is happening in the system at the moment is a lot of discussion. Finally, there is discussion about climate. But now the question is, all right, so what do I do? You know, as an organization, on the ground in the 30 countries where we are, what do we actually do? And Lucas said, you know, humanitarians are practical people, so let me try and be a little bit practical about breaking down what we could do. Firstly, we need to strengthen our existing programs. I don't think we've understood how fast this is coming at us and how vulnerable our supply chains, our procurement and transport processes are, our facilities are, our water infrastructure is, our clinical infrastructure is. Yeah? All of these things are massive accidents waiting to be flooded or to be heated out. So the first thing is actually just looking at our day jobs and working out where the vulnerabilities are and how we can make that more resilient. I would say the second thing is, and it's going back to a degree to what's been said already, and particularly to what Adil was saying, it's not just about disasters. The disasters that we were talking about will, of course, are already affecting people who are far, far more vulnerable to those disasters. Much higher levels of food security and malnutrition. In some cases, really extreme problems about access to clean water. Changes in the distribution pattern of things like waterborne diseases, cholera particularly, and in some places, vector-borne diseases as well. So every year is a day-by-day emergency for many people before the disaster hits. And we can't really say we're not there. You know, we only go there after the disaster, because we are there. We're there for decades now. We're sitting in these places for decades. So the next thing we've got to think about is what is our contribution to the resilience of people through our everyday programming. And then the third piece, which I think is, these are in increasing orders of difficulty, if you like. The third piece is there just isn't enough money. You know, we just haven't got the resources even to cover what we're trying to do now, let alone to cover what's going to happen. And whatever other resources might come online, and we might talk about that in a minute, it's really incumbent on any organization to think, how can we make our scarce resources go absolutely as far as possible? And in such a way that we are doing the first two things. We're building resilience, we're supporting infrastructures. And the answer to that goes right through localization. You know, the answer to that goes right through different models of how we do our business. In the health sector, for example, it's about task shifting. It's about much more community ownership. And it's about working with different stakeholders in different ways, with communities, the private sector, and so on. So if I were in the position of running an organization or running a country office, and I think it's good for organizations and country offices that I'm not, I would ask myself these three questions. The first one, what have we done to toughen up our infrastructure so that it's not overwhelmed by climate? If the answer is nothing, I'd be worried. The second question I'd ask myself is, what are we doing? How does our programming really support? Let's forget about we go to a meeting about the Nexus, you know, every couple of weeks. Really, how does our programming support? We've been here for a decade. How does it support the infrastructure, the resilience, the multiple elements of resilience of people who are there? And that's not giving people a goat, you know? That's about healthcare, and it's about community structures. What are we doing there? Yeah? And then the third piece is, the question I'd ask myself is, what are the big, difficult changes that we are making around the way we do our business to deal with a big, difficult problem? And if the answers to those three things are, dunno, not sure, and not so much, then I think it's time to be thinking very hard about how climate-aware and how climate-oriented, how future-oriented the organization is. And I would add a rider question for any donors in the room. When are you going to pay for any of this? Because getting money for climate is extremely difficult. There are not budget lines, and my experience has been going to public donors, they say, yeah, no, we really see it. It's actually a development issue. So we go back to the silos, yeah? Going to private donors, they say, no, we really see it, but you know, what we kind of want to do, what we want to be associated with, is stopping climate change. We don't want to clear up the mess. Yeah. So there is also a question, when you've answered those three questions, about how you pay for it.
Thank you, Paul. I'm sure would you like to react, Koko, to just what Paul said?
Love it, because that's what you're hearing about, the very practical things that are needed. And some are a big stretch, because defining on the back end the way donors define their budget pockets, that is a tough thing to tackle. But I love what you were saying about, so what are our organizations doing? Our organization, for example, IOM, we do shelter in the shelter cluster. So we're undertaking, just to respond to you, we're undertaking horizon scanning. We're using the 400 missions that we have and asking people on the ground who have deep domain expertise about their view of drivers. It is not a very easy endeavor as a social scientist to try and predict human behavior, but we can understand the drivers a bit better and pre-position and do our work there a little bit better. We can understand the sex, the age, in some cases the nationalities of people moving to enable better meeting of their needs. There's so much to be done. And I loved what you said about the finance piece. And here, just because of the organization that I'm in, we work a lot with frontline communities, obviously migrants and their families. So just a word, today is an International Day of Remittances. And the word family is in there too. Because when you think of migrants, often you think of maybe the person who's in front of you. But did you know that 1 in 9 people on this planet either send or beneficiaries of remittances? This is a tremendous value. And since we were talking about communities and building that connection across our societies, so important. How can we involve the diaspora? They often know their communities better than many organizations, and they're reaching the people who are at the front lines. How do we work with migrants and enable them to help their families? And there are many countries that have, hopefully it's okay, there are many countries that have remittance programs, matching programs. That's an additional, and I'm not saying this is substituting in any way, but remittances are one of the largest flows of, for sure, person to person and community to community. They dwarf ODA. It's very, very significant. How can we rethink who we are and how we do what we do to make sure that we include the people who are not only part of the solution, but also know the people who are affected? And I think there's just so much very practical work that is going on and that needs to happen even more. And again, to you as experts in the room and students, if you are getting an MBA, I don't know if any of you are, we really need you because you know how to design finance. You know, as the future, that digital platforms are rapidly reducing the cost of sending money home. This matters. It creates margin for people who don't have very much, and that's what we're talking about, creating breathing space, creating trust, and helping the humanitarian, what we call now a sector, kind of teach us all what we need to do to build that stability, resilience, and to make the changes that are necessary now and that are just going to be part of our lives going forward with climate change.
Thank you. I would like to take the opportunity, as you said, to really listen, to have this space for breathing and go into also the questions of our public, because I'm sure there might be quite a lot of questions and we can continue our discussion and sharing your expertise. So the floor is now open for questions. I would really like to gather 3 questions and then ask our panelists to answer them. Please.
Hi, my name is Najam. I also worked for MSF. I think connecting this panel to the previous panel, I would like to ask a question about the humanitarian principles. We always thought the principle of neutrality is core, or all of the 4 humanitarian principles are non-negotiable. When we look at the definition of neutrality, it means we're not to take part in hostilities, but we're also not to engage in political controversies. And I think core of the problem is still that we partially see the climate crisis as a political controversy, and we therefore do not accept as humanitarians that we have to engage differently. And I think what I understood from the panel is the demand to engage more in preparedness activity. I don't really see that happening so far. So I would also like to know from the panel, how can we maybe shift and reinterpret that one principle?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see in the back.
Thank you very much. So if nobody has a question, I ask my question. I would like to know from the panel and mainly from the keynote speaker maybe, what do you think is our responsibility, especially as Austrian NGOs, which have a very high level or the highest level of trust among our communities towards mitigation, because it's very clear that because the adaptation in other countries has to happen, and we help for this adaptation because of climate change, which comes mainly from our industrial countries. So it's a question like, what's our responsibility here because you said it very well, like we are one country if we see the world as a country. We cannot say we do something there and here we don't. So it's more about the potential and also the humanitarian principle, whether we have that also here.
Yeah, so I'm from the Austrian Center for Peace. I also have a humanitarian background, and my question or my comment also goes in that direction. So in our work where we're trying to do some of the things that were mentioned by you, so to look at the political implications of conflict and then trying to tackle them and solve them. So in some of the countries where we're doing this, we have come across, of course, these dynamics of where indeed we realize that some of the underlying or sometimes very obvious root causes for conflict are caused by climate change and environmental degradation. Now, of course, also our angle is a very particular one that can address certain parts of the humongous issue that is in front of ourselves when we talk about this challenge of climate change. And now here comes my question. I work from the peace angle, from the conflict resolution angle, with a particular approach. You work from the humanitarian angle with a very particular approach. How can we, and then indeed we have this whole dynamic about working in our own spheres, silos, as we often say it. So how can we best bridge these silos and really work together? It's a super difficult question, but there's so many clever people on this panel, maybe there's an answer.
Thank you. So I would like to start with the first question about how it is possible to reclaim also the principle of neutrality. Against this background, the humanitarian actors are acting in political context also against climate crisis. And you would like to respond to that, for sure.
Can I, since I know nothing about the humanitarian section, let me pontificate on that. I'm a professor. So I'll merge the three questions. Actually, in some ways, they are the same. I've been struggling a lot with the principles in preparation for this over the last 2 months as I've talked to colleagues. And they're wonderful, and I do understand where they're coming from, the conflict context. But as I think about neutrality, for example, and I want to link it to responsibility, it seems to me, just as an outsider, you have to be neutral to the parties, not neutral to the problem. Right? You're not neutral about hunger or about disease, right? And maybe that's one of the ways to look at climate. What you are neutral between or impartial between are the parties, because very often our framework is of conflict where there are parties, right? Here, the conflict is between sort of this change. And that brings me to what I hope is the fifth principle. Now, Andreas told me there are 7, some other. But if I take the 4, I kept hoping there was a fifth principle. And I think, especially if we take climate seriously, we will have to adopt that also in our climate world. And that's the principle of responsibility, right? That's your question. That's the principle of having our fingerprint, my carbon molecule. Right? Now, that principle of responsibility can either go the conflictual route, which I think it is going in the COPs, with loss and damage, and you cause the problem, therefore you pay me. I sympathize with that, but politically I don't see that happening. Or that principle of responsibility can go to, we are doing this not simply out of altruism, but a global responsibility, because we are confronted with a problem that doesn't fit our international borders. Right? I'm making a big ask here. But I do think that there is a principle of responsibility, at least in the climate work and maybe more, that we need to also voluntarily think about, very much like you are. And I think that's also the link to the peace and conflict, right? But I'll stop there.
So you summarized also the 3 questions. There were also kind of all asked how we really can manage so different sectors to join the forces. Véronique?
Can I just go back to the question of principles? Because indeed, it's a big question. But I'm speaking only on my behalf. There is no organization behind me, but we have to go back to the roots of those humanitarian principles, from where they come. It was during a conflict situation and enabling international organizations to cross lines. So we need to be neutral to cross lines. What does that mean for a local movement in a place? These principles were not set for this kind of people, of groups. So what would be, for me, a big mistake is to set those principles as barriers for newcomers to come when we need to work together. So I think that we have to interpret this. Mervat, you said that earlier this morning. When we are in a place, we have to interpret and discuss with the people in the context, what does this principle means? And I think that, yes, we have to enter into much more politicized discussion and be in solidarity with those who are the most in need, because this is a question of justice. So we have to reinterpret, in the context of climate change, what does neutrality mean, really? And what do we need? What is the humanitarian imperative in this specific context? And yeah, if our standards, our principles are becoming barriers, we have a problem. When we need to broaden the scope and work and learn how to work with others. So, yeah, I'm very much in favor of debating around, what were in fact operational principles and became dogmas in the sector. Yeah.
So we have also challenging question also from Véronique. So the principles that might have become a dogma. Would you like to react to that, Paul?
I'm just wondering if I can make it to the door before you lot jump on me. We haven't ever been here before. Yeah, it hasn't ever been this hot on Earth for 230,000 years. So everything that we know, all human civilization, all agriculture, all of it, the whole lot, apart from stone tools, actually, happened in history in a situation that's not the situation that we are now in. Which sounds dramatic, but it is actually just a statement of fact. So principle-wise, anything-wise, I don't think anything should be off the table, really. I don't think anything should be non-negotiable or outside the ability to discuss it in the new context. So to that degree, I think I would very much, and I don't think we know where this goes either. I think the thing is that until we actually do the work, do the work on the ground, I don't know if we know how things develop and what the challenges to the principles are and how the principles help us get things done, but also get in the way of other things being done. But as we move forward, I think we should be asking ourselves those questions, and I don't think we should be saying, no, we're not going to negotiate about that, we're not going to discuss that. That, again, is a personal opinion. What does that mean when it comes to working across silos? What does it mean when it comes to working in part? Because we're going to need a bigger boat, And that's a lot of different skills and expertise and points of view coming together to work around this. So I will suggest a couple of things, and I'd be really interested if you could suggest a couple of things, because you're coming from a peace-building place, if that's okay. So in terms of where humanitarians, I think, have found it more effective working across silos, I think the conditions have been that they have been working in, and this is not necessarily in a lot of places, But they have tended to be working on these higher order objectives which combine, which are trying to get with a population to a place that combines peace and environment and developmental issues and classic humanitarian issues, and that's the planning process and the assessment process. And unfortunately, the bureaucratic processes that we have at the moment in the system make that quite hard to do, but they're possible. So it is actually just about joint planning to a higher order goal, and then working out what your bit is, what my bit is, and how we interrelate across those things. And there are examples of that working, and they seem to work when two other conditions are in place. One, that it's being done really locally, not necessarily in the capital city, but in the place where the activities are going to take place, and guided by the people on the front line. And the other is that it's incentivized by the money, so that the donors are saying, we expect to see this happen, we expect you to be working together. And where those conditions are in place, suddenly it kind of becomes a lot easier, I think, to achieve that relationship. So that would be from my side, but I'd be really interested to know a peace builder's point of view.
Thank you. I think also we'll have a chance to network and get some
input
from the experts also that are today at the Congress. That's also the goal of having the chances to hear what the suggestions are from different stakeholders in order to find solutions to very challenging questions, especially when we're talking about the climate crisis and humanitarian action. We have still time left for 1 or 2 questions, depending on the complexity. So I would like to give you a chance to ask some questions. I know that we have a couple. I see. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Christopher Bartog. I work for the Austrian Red Cross. Just some reflections on the practicalities of sort of the things that were said here. Preparing for climate impacts is something that Red Cross movements, various UN actors have suddenly caught up on in the last few years with disaster preparedness, forecast-based action, forecast-based finance. Now, the trouble we're running into with that is that it's kind of not a sure thing. If I do a budgeting or a project based on a disaster that might or might not happen in a certain region with a certain likelihood that might or might not basically come true, then I might definitely, no, I don't might, but I will definitely be in trouble with our donors because they will ask us, well, what came of our money? To some degree. That's always a thing that I have to be prepared for, and that I have to, this is the reason why there's not like loads of money going into this sort of thing, because there's a huge risk involved. And we're kind of now buffering that risk. And as a Red Crescent organization, we're working with this is kind of the second aspect, we're working with the host national society in every country. And then there's the question of funding. For this thing to be successful, we need to fund local structures permanently, not just on an emergency basis, not just when the disaster comes or when it is only 3 days away and where we can do the predictions. And getting funds to fund personnel, buildings, vehicles, response structures, all the what local organizations just need as much as we would, is still a huge challenge. That's that. Thanks.
I saw a second hand in the back, here on the left side. This will be the last question we receive right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Anna. I am from CAICID, the International Dialogue Center, where we promote interreligious and intercultural dialogue as a tool for social inclusion, but also to contribute towards peace, as well as humanitarian crisis. I am a programs officer for the Fellows Program, which is a program that capacitates religious leaders in interreligious dialogue so they can go back to their communities. We have a network of around 500 fellows now, and I guess it was really interesting hearing more about climate change and faith. Climate change, because our fellows had a crucial role when the floods in Pakistan happened last year in supporting their communities. So I was wondering, when it comes to global and shared responsibility, how do you see and where do you see the role of religious leaders and educators and faith-based organizations? Because I haven't heard much about the role that they play. I understand I've been struggling a bit with the principles as well when it comes to neutrality and impartiality. So I know it can be controversial when we're talking about, I guess, religion. But I would like to hear from you. Where do these stakeholders stand? Thank you.
Oh, you're looking at me. Just maybe a point. What people believe and what draws us together, whether it's around a table, whether it's in a place of worship in our communities, it is almost the most powerful thing that people have. It's the connection, and it's the likeness. There's so many examples of the positive impact of faith-based groups in the world. And I mentioned big change. If this is an area where we're experiencing big change globally, spatially, temporally, climate change is, it's big. And people are, of course, we've gotten ourselves into this, and that's where the answers lie. And being connected with people is the requisite for big change where people are involved. So you have to have people that are legitimate, that are relevant to you, that are like you enough, and faith-based groups are one example of that, in order to share examples of what's the right thing to do. And I loved the example between humanitarian and peace. I'm going to a totally different scale and a different area of the world as we know it, but it's like that. It's reaching out across whatever we think is maybe not us, but somebody else. It's a sector, it's a whatever, but figuring out in very practical ways, how do we build likeness and relevance? Because we have a lot, there's a lot that we don't know, but by definition, we have to start where we are to take the next step. And I think there's a lot of potential there, and it has an architecture, by the way. You require networks, you require neighborhoods, and a neighborhood are individuals or organizations who are enough like that they communicate with one another. You need a specific practice, and one of those network members talking to another and endorsing or saying, don't do that, didn't work out well. That is what is the the fundamental unit of big change. And organizations like yours have a big role to play. We have a lot to learn from you.
Thank you for those words also, and I would like to use them also to lead our panel to an end, really with this invitation of this importance of networks, of the importance of breaking those silos that we are all confronted right now, and use the opportunity that it's not only humanitarians that are here today, so we have hopefully very diverse groups and reach out to each other and discuss how we can find those joint solutions. So thank you so much for discussing this.
Thank you.
This time with me right now. And